Okay, so you will have noticed that this is just a good old-fashioned Zoom room. The idea of that is feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions along. We want this to be as conversational as possible. Obviously, you're Honeycomb users, so thank you very much for using Honeycomb. We really appreciate that. And today we're just going to talk about best practices, how to really utilize Honeycomb in all the awesome ways. And train you on the best ways to do Honeycomb things. So I will get started. My name is Jenny Boyer. I'm an account executive at Honeycomb. I've been here for almost 4 years, and I've worked with 494 different clients on observability, Honeycomb, what it is, what it isn't. And so somewhat of an expert, I think. Put my 10,000 hours in. And then I have my lovely SA team here. I have Pierre Tessier, who is our Director of Solutions Architect. Excuse me. I'm so sorry, Sasha. I can't even. I haven't had a full cup of coffee yet.
Sasha Sharma.
Thank you.
It's a little bit of a tongue twister.
Who's a lovely SA here, and then Brian Langbecker, who is a senior solutions architect at Honeycomb. And these are our presenters today. So I will, further ado, pass it to Sasha.
Hi, folks. So I'm Sasha. I'm a solutions architect here at Honeycomb, and I wanted to talk to y'all a little bit about instrumentation today. You're all users of Honeycomb, like Jenny already called out. So you're probably familiar with the fact that Honeycomb is basically all OpenTelemetry native. We're built on OpenTelemetry best practices, and we've very much leaned into the principles and the semantic conventions of OpenTelemetry. What does that mean? Boop. Thanks, Jenny. What that means is it's really easy to get started in Honeycomb. Day one, you're going to want to get your auto instrumentation libraries in. So for example, if you're using Python or something like that, there's auto instrumentation libraries and distros available for Fast API or Flask and all those kinds of things that you can get started with right off the bat and get your data into Honeycomb. That said, over time, instrumentation is going to be a bit of a journey. So once you've got your auto instrumentation, data flowing in, you're going to realize things like, well, this information is not actually all that useful. This, these spans that are coming from our gRPC or net HTTP instrumentation aren't necessarily useful to me or my engineers. And at that point, what we suggest is that you start picking some services, some specific apps that you're, kind of having expectations already of what you'd like to see, what your team would like to see, and start instrumenting those with some of that custom instrumentation. That's going to be month 1 for you. Generally, we see folks move to that phase a lot faster. Week 1, week 2, they're kind of like ready to say, okay, let's start instrumenting some of those painful services because we want to see what information we can get there. And after that, you're going to start actually getting a little bit more reactive with Honeycomb. And what I mean by that is at this point, you have a pretty good understanding of what data is coming in from the instrumentation that you've put in place. This includes both some of that custom instrumentation that you've put in, and we'll talk about what that means in just a second as well. But at this point, you're kind of like, all right, I have a good handle on what's coming in. I can start setting some triggers. I can start setting some SLOs, and Pierre is going to get into those as well a little bit later. But at this point, you're ready to start being a little bit more reactive to your services as issues come in or as things are kind of like looking funky in your golden signals. And the Honeycomb homepage is where you'll see those 3 golden signals as well. Now, after that is where things start to get really interesting. This is where we actually start to get proactive with the data that's coming in. And this is where those SLOs are going to come in super handy. And that custom instrumentation that you put in is going to come in super, super handy. So if you're not already familiar with this, Honeycomb supports wide event formats, right? Which means any event that you send to Honeycomb, you can add up to 2,000 different attributes with each of those events. What does that mean? That means any information that's going to be useful to you, your developers, in debugging any kinds of issues, any kind of log messages that you're sending in, send those in as span attributes. And that's how you will get proactive. That's how you'll go in and be able to slice and dice your data with the information that's coming in as part of those span attributes. So things like customer ID, for example, or tenant ID, you can send those in as span attributes. And when you're building your SLOs to learn how to be, proactive, you can absolutely set those with those, custom span attributes that are coming in to say, hey, it actually looks like one particular user is having an issue based on this SLO that I'm looking at that's actually tracking latency for all of my users that are in the system. And when your SLO fires, you can go ahead and pinpoint, actually, it just looks like there's one particular user that's having this issue or a bad experience, or it looks like there's one particular user agent. It's actually just hitting Android version, blah, 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 that's actually having an issue. I'll pause there. I know I kind of went through that really fast. See if there's any questions that come up.
I have a question. I don't know if this is a stupid question. What is a span attribute?
That's a great question. So hopefully everybody here is a little bit familiar with OpenTelemetry, and how OpenTelemetry data will come into Honeycomb is you'll have your root spans. That's your base span that starts your trace. And your root span is going to have children spans, which will have a parent span ID. Each of the spans that you sent to Honeycomb via either auto instrumentation or custom instrumentation has span attributes attached to it. Some of these are, essential ones that are defined by semantic conventions. Duration millisecond is one of those that every span that comes into Honeycomb will have a duration millisecond attribute. But you can add span attributes to spans that come into Honeycomb. So things like customer ID, things like transaction IDs. If you're using GUIDs or UUIDs to identify your customers in your systems, those are things you can add as span attributes. And I believe it's pretty straightforward in most languages to add these span attributes. I think it's like span.add attribute or, span.set attribute or something like that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else that comes up for anybody? Sweet. And the next two things that I'll talk about is, at this point, you've got your SLOs in place, you've got your triggers in place. At this point, it's time to make it a part of a process to make sure any new applications, any new services that are being spun up in your org are actually using OpenTelemetry, are actually sending data to Honeycomb. So that way, all of your devs, all of the folks that are on your on-call rotation know exactly where to go, know exactly where to find the information in case issues happen. And one thing I'll recommend here is our team actually will put runbooks for incidents in the things that they track in their SLOs. So in your SLO dashboard, for example, or where you've set your SLO, go ahead in the description, put a link to your runbook, put a link to your incident runbook that's related to that particular issue that you're tracking with Honeycomb, so that when your on-call rotation devs come in and they're looking at this particular SLO that fires, they know exactly where to go to see where other folks in the company, where other folks on the rotation have gone to solve that issue or resolve that issue in the past. The last thing I'll talk about is tech debt. At this point, we've been reactive, we've been proactive, we've even got, OpenTelemetry and Honeycomb as part of the process when we're spinning up new services. And now it's time to optimize. This is where we start to use Honeycomb to actually say, what are the issues? Where are we seeing latency? Where are we seeing particular slowdowns in code? Or where are we calling, a particular function or a particular for loop a gajillion times where maybe we don't need to? This is where you start to do that. This is where you start to identify tech debt. Do you have maybe old dependencies that you're using? I don't know, are you using PG8 where, Postgres is now at, I think, release version 12. Is this maybe a good time to upgrade that? This is where you start to actually identify how you can optimize your code libraries, how you can optimize what exactly you're shipping out into the world. I'll stop there, see if there's any questions, anything that comes up for anybody.
I have a question again. So for tech debt and using Honeycomb specifically for tech debt, what view would you use? Would you use like tracing? Like how would you kind of find those optimizations?
That's a great question. So something I found really useful, number one, is actually just using Bubble Up to identify these things. It's kind of funny, but the PG8 issue that I talked about a little bit earlier, there is actually somebody that I was talking to who were having latency issues, but it turned out it was specifically because they were using an older version of Postgres where slow queries were being tracked in a specific way. So their queries weren't actually slow. Their queries were returning fine, but it turned out that this older version just tracked things in a funny way. So Bubble Up is actually a great way to surface some of this information. The second thing I'll talk about is just, honestly, golden signals can be a great place to just start and notice, all right, it looks like I shipped a particular change. And I think we at Honeycomb do this a lot where we'll ship something and we'll realize, okay, actually, it looks like it caused this huge dip in our latency graph. It looks like our duration millisecond overall went down a lot. What did we do to change that? What did we do that actually ended up in that huge improvement? And that can be a really great way to say, we did this to optimize this. Maybe we should socialize this information, have other teams kind of, hop on the bandwagon as well.
Thank you.
Awesome. Boop. Cool. And now we'll actually get into those attributes and spans that Jenny very kindly asked about a little bit earlier. So we talked about how Honeycomb does support, these wide event formats. And that means you can send, I think it's again, up to 2,000 attributes per event that you send into Honeycomb. What make good attributes right out of the box, right out of that starting line? What are some things that you can send? We talked about some of those environmental attributes, right? Send in those version numbers. We talked about PG8 versus, PG12 or something like that. Send in your server names. Send in your build IDs. This one's actually really, really important. I highly recommend sending your build IDs, especially if you're doing any kind of CI/CD in your organization. Please send your build IDs. That is going to be hugely useful when you're deciding, do I want to revert a particular commit? Do I want to actually roll back a particular build ID that I shipped? That's going to be hugely useful for you. Send your Kubernetes data, send your pod names and pod labels, so you can actually figure out, hey, are there particular pods that are just, having trouble starting up? Are there particular pods that are running particular services that are having issues? And that way, it can also lead you down to actually diagnosing issues with your services. If you spot some pods that are just over and over again running out of memory or something like that, that's a great place to say, well, what the heck is happening with the code that this pod is running? What the heck is happening with the code, with the application code that's running on this particular infrastructure? Send your region. If there's an outage, let's say AWS US West 1, I'm sure most folks here were hit last year when that happened. That's absolutely something that you can send. So Ankit looks like has a question: how to remove the attributes which are built in Honeycomb and not useful. Ankit, can you tell me a little bit more about what you're finding not useful?
Yeah, sometimes these release versions or release tags are not useful. The inbuilt attributes by Honeycomb is not useful for us. So
Gotcha.
You could hide those in the Honeycomb UI. I would hate to say I want to remove them. You're allowed up to 2,000 attributes for every span with no penalty within Honeycomb. Please make use of that. One day in the future, you may actually say to yourself, wow, we could really benefit from this release name tag or whatever it is, as it might be used for help you glean a little bit more context with it.
And one thing I can see, maybe you're having trouble with is, maybe it's showing up in Bubble Up or something. And what Pierre said will absolutely do exactly, what you're hopefully expecting to see in Bubble Up. They won't show up once you hide them in Bubble Up results.
Okay, great, thanks.
Cool. And let's talk a little bit about these code level attributes that, you can send, and I highly recommend that you do. Function names are a really, really big one. This is one thing that has made life a lot easier, even as I've just, experimentally set up some things in Honeycomb and with OpenTelemetry. 100% send these, especially if you're sending things like span events. Absolutely go send your function name so that you can figure out what's changing in this particular for loop, for example, down the line. Absolutely do that. Variables, these are kind of like breadcrumbs to help you diagnose, where that trail is, help you pick up that trail of where the issue actually happened. Super, super important. Business logic, if you have, particular rules that you're tracking, let's say a particular type of user in your application has a different type of business logic that they are expected to follow, or it's a particular type of user that can't access certain pages or some things like that. Absolutely identify those in your span attributes as well. Again, size of lists, status codes, errors, exceptions, those are all things that you can send as well. Status codes, errors, and exceptions, those are some things that you will get out of the box with most auto instrumentation libraries as well. I'll pause there, see if there's any other questions that come up for folks.
Well, I have a question. Which one of these can I do without changing code?
That's a really good question. So like I said, status codes, errors, and exceptions, you're going to get out of the box. You don't need to do anything to get those into Honeycomb.
I think all the environmentals can be done without changing code. With OpenTelemetry, you can set all that up with resource attributes.
Yep, that as well. You can do a lot of those. Go ahead. Sorry, Pierre.
I was say much of the external stuff, because we're leveraging likely some auto instrumented library from OpenTelemetry, will also include some of those details, like your database calls will include DB statement. There's a few other fields that's eluding me right now, but even accessing a third-party API, you'll have that HTTP route or gRPC route captured for you as well.
Yep.
So is this with auto instrumentation? Like, what do you mean by you have all the environment variables available to you?
All right, so auto instrumentation for the external stuff, for sure. You'll need auto instrumentation there. It'll need to exist within the API. For the environmental, all SDKs for OpenTelemetry support an environment variable known as OTel resource attributes. And it's a key value pair set that you would just pass in as an environment variable when you start up your pod. Pod name, labels, build ID, all these things would be known to you at startup time. So that's where you would set them.
Yeah, but you're pulling them. It's not like the SDK is doing that automatically. You're being explicit about what you want to, which environment variables you want to set.
Yeah, sure. But I guess what we're saying is without modifying code. So you do this to an environment variable, and then the SDK reads that environment variable and sets those attributes on every span produced. Okay,
so there's like a certain set of environment variables that the SDK will pull and set. Okay. Mm-hmm. What about, so like, what if I have, and I'm assuming this is like on a pod or Kubernetes environment or whatnot. I'm sure other people might be running in Lambda or whatnot, but my question is around a Kubes environment. What about grabbing custom annotations or labels? Is there a best practice for that?
So you want an annotation on your pod to also be added as an attribute to all spans?
I don't know about all spans, but I definitely want it to be searchable.
Labels is let me come back and say this. So the environment variable I'm talking about is called OTel _ resource _ attributes, and it's a generic variable that you just pass it key value pairs, and it adds all those key value pairs to every span. Okay. So when you're setting up the annotations and everything else, you also have access to the pod's manifest, or the deployments manifest. You would set right there that environment variable to be that long string that you're looking for.
All right, so I could use like Helm templating or something and just like throw everything.
Okay. Yes, that's what I'm trying to get at. Your CD process here, or whether it's Argo CD or Helm or whatever you're using to deploy that pod manifest, you're going to have it spelled out in there to pull from whatever variables, and definitely make use of the Kubernetes downward API as well if you have to, and just define this thing as your last environment variable part of your manifest.
Okay, thank you.
The other thing that I will say is if you're not wanting to send some of your environment variables to all your spans, you can absolutely grab them with getenv or something like that within your code and add them as span attributes if that's something that's more interesting to y'all. Cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think the danger by doing it programmatically or writing some script in your CI is that you grab environment variables that are secret
Yep.
or whatnot. So
Yep.
yeah, I could see security concerns. All right.
Absolutely. Yep. Anything else that comes up for folks before I move on? All right. So I think, we've kind of covered most of these. The last thing I'll just call out is, especially if your services are calling to third-party APIs, that is absolutely something that you want to flag as span attributes. Let's say, your service is a checkout service, an online boutique store or something like that, and it's calling Shopify or it's calling Plaid. And Plaid has promised you a certain, certain amount of time that they want to return something in, and you want to down the line track that in an SLO. Send those as span attributes so that you can actually track some of that information and actually keep track of what's going on if there's an issue happening in your service or if there is an issue happening in a third-party library that you're actually using. All right, boop. Awesome. So this really just cuts back to how we actually suggest that you send some of those span attributes. And what we suggest is actually following the example that the OpenTelemetry and the beelines have set in this particular regard. So y'all are probably familiar with semantic conventions that OpenTelemetry has set. One thing that they do is they use namespaces with dots to kind of make sure, span attributes that are of a similar type that give you similar types of information about different areas of code, different pieces of your code, kind of stay together. And when you're looking at them in Honeycomb, you can find them in a much, much easier, much more straightforward way. So things like, tracing data, you'll see when it comes into Honeycomb, it'll have that trace.trace ID or trace.parent ID and things like that. Now, let's say your different services, for example, have a particular name. I highly suggest doing something like app or service dot shopping cart or recommendation service or app dot email service or something like that. So that way, when you're looking for just information that's coming from that particular service or that particular application, and you're looking in the Honeycomb sidebar to kind of keep track of this information in your head when you're running a root cause analysis or something like that, it's super easy, super straightforward to, draw your eye right to that information. Or if you're looking in the query builder for an easy way to group your data, this is how I recommend keeping all that information together so that way you have access to it at your fingertips. Anything that comes up there for y'all?
Doesn't, like, I've seen this before, the app dot whatever. And I hear your argument, but doesn't the tracer already put, if I say, hey, initiate a tracer in this package, and forgive me because I'm running Node and Go right now, so those are the two SDKs I'm familiar with. But you already have the package that you're in. You already know that you're in a custom package, like my own package. I think that that's more descriptive than app, which could exist anywhere in my application.
I think what we're saying is it should be app dot and then your package prefix. And this is to help you, particularly in organizing your fields. As if you just use the package name, what if your package is called DB? Well, DBs also happens to be an auto-instrumented thing. So now your fields are mixing in with the auto-instrumented fields. So the idea here is to prefix everything with app dot. I'll also point out that there's an OTEP or an OpenTelemetry proposal to make this a thing with the SDKs themselves.
Okay.
So we're recommending it as best practice today. I would believe that if we had this conversation again in several more months, it'll be far more automated for you within the OpenTelemetry SDKs as well. So to get on the best practice, start with that app dot right away.
Okay. I just don't like writing it. That's all it is.
I agree with you. And that's why I think we have a proposal out there, which is when you bootstrap your tracer, you're going to tell it prefix all manual span attributes with app dot, something along those lines to take care of that. So I am with you, Jason. Who wants to write code? Who wants to, like, it's 4 more, like, no, right? Yeah. So.
Awesome. All right. If there are no other questions, I will boop and pass to Brian.
Okay, sales girl here. I got to keep everybody on schedule. So we got 33 minutes left and we still have a lot of content. So I just want to
We can always
love the questions. Just saying, I just want to time check everybody here.
Okay, well,
But
you
go ahead,
got to
Brian.
stop sharing the screen because I'm taking over.
Oh, okay. I'll stop. Perfect. Relieve me of my screen responsibilities.
For a very, very short amount of time. That's all I'm doing. Okay, so I'm going to talk bubble up, querying, tracing a little bit. Might as well do it with the product. Let's jump right in. Ask any questions you need. Jenny, keep me on track on things. If you're waving your hands, I will have no idea you're doing it. So we're going to start on the main page here. And this is what Sasha was talking about, golden signals. Now, if I were looking at this page, and I've looked at dozens of pages like this and many a tool, I would look at the top and say, okay, my throughput seems pretty good. My error rate is up and down, but it's all within a certain range. Something interesting is happening right after I've done a deployment marker that's going on here. After I deployed, we get this little upswing here. We happen to have this awesome thing called bubble up. And what is bubble up? It basically surfaces in a unbiased fashion what the crap is going on in your system here. Before I jump in, I want to orient you. We love our heat maps in our system here. And heat maps are core to bubble up at this point in time. I'm actually doing a heat map on duration across this. And all of a sudden I notice I do the deployment marker, it jumps way up. With bubble up, I can go in here and grab this, pull it over this area. And what it's doing, it is looking at every data point on this entire screen and basically telling you there are some things that are different and you should go really look at those. First one it tells me is 100% of my selection involves cart checkout. In this demo, I'm doing a fictitious purchasing website. It confirms it over here, it confirms it there, even says it's a post, right down to this little field, this little discussion we just had of app prefix with user ID. Honeycomb is very big on what sucks for a user. User can be an actual user, can be that third-party API endpoint. It could be all kinds of different things. We want to be able to drive down into that. So it basically said, I'm doing a checkout and 50-ish% of my problems are all affecting one user. So what is going on with the system? I can also see that, I've got a number of products that are still going through the system. I can even get down into my build ID. All of a sudden my build changed, that build marker came out, and all of a sudden my problems started to occur within that build marker. What I can do over here is I want to see the difference between that user and other users. I'm going to type the word count real quickly. I'm going to jump down and I want to see it against this route where it's that value. And I'm going to jump over here and I'm going to say, you know what, I want to group by this field. And I'm going to just go over here and run it real quick. And we see that that user indeed is having some bad performance going on. I could even go down here. In the interest of time, I'm going to go really fast. I can look at the spark lines, and when I hit the spark line for that one particular user, they are having a less than ideal experience. So I've used my query to nail things down real quickly. I'm going to just pick something on this screen and click on it. So what have we done so far? And I'm going to stop for a second because Jenny's like time checking things. So I want to get going to SLOs, which is the perfect thing in the system. We did bubble up. We kind of figured out it looks like it's one user and one endpoint. We've systematically worked through the data right down to an actual trace in the system. This is where Sasha was talking about attributes. You can add attributes right here. We added app user ID is an attribute decorating a span. Each and every one of these lines are spans within a system, or for simple terms, everybody will cringe, it's like a log line behind the scenes. It's just a log line that is highly organized. If we looked into this system, we will see all our problems exist in this one area that are going on. In the interest of time, if I were to go back and click that deployment marker, I'm playing with my cache. I'm trying to test out a new cache thing. Only one user is enabled for it. We're having problems within the system itself. Any kind of questions there? And I'm going to show you that you can not only bubble up on things like duration, but you can bubble up on something called status codes. Since I'm blazing along, trying to ensure we get some time back, any kind of questions at this point in time? Jason? Anybody? All right. Any questions from my own set of folks here, which is we can go on that. So what if we like this? This is pretty awesome here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump right over here and I'm going to go to ALB logs on our backend system at Honeycomb. This is production level data. So with this, the first one we did a heat map on duration, right? We saw this little heat map swing up. We looked at the thing. We figured it's user 20109. And then, you know, in the interest of time, if I clicked on the marker, we would have seen we changed the cache. It affects that one particular user in the system here. But we not only can do that, we can look at just pure log level data and say my backend status code. And as we look at this, we go from basically good to bad, which is good is down here, bad is getting worse. We got some 400 problems here. I can go grab this area. I'm actually going to hit bubble up. I go grab this area that is here within the system. And okay, this is the curse of Brian keeping his links not up to date. We'll go grab that one. And it's looking through all my data that's going there. And what is it doing now? Well, it's awesome. It is saying to me, and I haven't even looked at this today, it's all 501 errors. It's confirmed here. I can look through here to see the shape of the request. It's tracing problems are going on right now. Oh, it actually looks Pierre. It's almost our favorite customer that's going on. I can see it's going through tracing. I won't highlight the client IP, but this is the richness of the fact that I can bring in all this information that's going through the system here. And I can look at it, what's going on at any one point in time. All of this data is actually changing within the system itself. So I roll into this, I do the bubble up. It could be like yesterday, wasn't it yesterday, Sasha, that I was seeing a bunch of authentication problems from certain people that was in the bubble up? Actually, you weren't around yesterday, Sasha. So yesterday it was authentication issues from our front end website. It's all different things going on. And, you know, if I see something here and I really want to look at something like domain, I can just type it here. I don't have to go searching through things anymore. And oh my, today it's actually an API problem. Yesterday, it was the UI that was going on in the system here. So all kinds of different ways to search your data, but this is all based on bubble up. I can't really look into a search here because I run a distinct risk of actually showing you customers' data itself here. So any questions from this section? And now I'm gonna lead up to
I just want to comment on how cool and powerful it is to do bubble ups on things not called duration. Brian, can you go to the homepage and just show them a bubble up off of the APM home? I don't care which one you use.
You want to use prod?
Yeah, we're gonna leak a feature that's not out yet. It will be coming out in probably a few more weeks, 3-ish, maybe 4 more weeks. It should be visible here. Just go to push the on the bottom there on the table that we have in view right now.
On the bottom.
Just bubble
right
up
here?
the no.
Oh, right here.
Yeah.
Okay,
So we're gonna be adding
for it.
buttons to auto bubble up groups. This probably told us nothing for now because I put Brian on the spot. But what Brian just did, going from the home page, from a result table and clicking on a button and doing an automatic bubble up, that will be also coming to a query result table near you. And this will be effective for all queries. We've recognized that bubble up is probably our best feature. So we're going to make bubble up even easier to use in different scenarios And effectively, you're going to be able to do a bubble up of any grouped result. So when you do a group by in your query and you have a group in there, you're going to be able to say, hey, I'm grouped by status code. Why am I getting all these 502s? You hit one button and we'll tell you why.
How are you
super powerful
determining
feature.
the scope of the information to look at? Like,
So,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So right here, Ryan's drawing like a yellow box and he's selecting individual events on a heat map. What we'll do instead is we'll take a look at your query and you selected a group. So we know this group, everything that falls within that group is now those individual events versus the rest of the query results. Is how we are doing that selection.
So anything that doesn't have that group, or?
Yes, within your time range. And,
So this is
well,
the yellow.
Let me come back. So first off, we apply a filter criteria, if anything, to the query. And then we'll do the grouping. So then we'll say everything in the group versus everything outside the group. That's how we do the selection criteria.
Okay, too easy. All right, I get it now. Took me a bit.
So I'm really excited about this feature coming out. If you haven't been able to tell my voice, it'll be, you know, I'm pre-leaking. I probably shouldn't. Luckily, nobody from product is on this meeting, or I'd probably get in trouble.
They won't watch
me.
the recording either. So
No, they won't. They won't. Great. But it will be coming out in the next several weeks. We have some versions of it, as you can see already in our dog food environment. We can flag on customers today if you want it from your APM homepage. It'll be coming to the results set table next. Sorry, Brian.
Oh, you know, you're perfectly fine. We're good. I'm done unless you want me to show more stuff.
No, I'm ready for Jenny to show my slides.
all right.
I'm getting out of here. I'm stopping.
Picking you up, Brian.
What?
Thanks,
Yeah.
Brian. Great demo. It was awesome.
Need a couple boops.
Boop, boop, boop. All right.
Yeah.
Oh,
boop, boop,
did
boop.
we already do this?
One more boop.
One more boop.
One
One
more
more.
Let's talk about SLOs. Maybe you haven't heard of an SLO before. Maybe you have. Maybe you're like, man, this is my hardest thing to wrap my head around. And we get this a lot. Well, we do SLOs in Honeycomb. We talk a lot about SLOs. And recently, several months ago, I should say, we gave every single pro team 2 SLOs to play with. And we really want you to use these to prioritize the way you make your engineering decisions, to ensure your customers are actually happy, right? You probably heard this line many times from Honeycomb. 9s don't matter if your users aren't happy. SLOs are meant to measure customer satisfaction, customer happiness. And if you use that, you'll be able to understand and you can focus on what really matters for your customers. SLOs also help you understand individual symptoms that are coming out. Well, I should say actionable SLOs help you understand that. And we do those inside of Honeycomb. Let's dive in a little bit more about how to create an SLI, which is what the measurement thing we use to do SLOs. Boop. So I'm going to talk about a couple different types of applications first off. The first one, request response. We are very familiar with these. The majority of the things we work on are request response style services. And really what you care about when these things are, what measures customer happiness? And customer happiness doesn't always have to be your end customer. It could just be another engineering team that leverages your service via an API. So when we think about happiness here, we think about availability without an error, right? Latency is huge as well. People care about latency. And I would go as far as say, you should be able to combine latency and availability into a single SLI all the time. And there's quality. And this is more about perhaps a different kind of latency being returned, or even just if you send me this, I have to respond with Y all the time, and checking to make sure that you're actually responding with Y when you're getting X. That's the quality. These are the things that we think about you should be thinking of in terms of how do I build the thing to measure customer happiness. If you have a request response style service, which is the majority of the things we work on out here in the world, then you want to think about availability, latency, and quality. That's what matters for your service. Boop. Another super popular kind of service is data processing. Typically, you'll have 1 or 2, maybe 3 of those, depending on your application. You have a lot more request response things, but they'll probably all interact with that data processing thing in some way, some form. These ones also do a lot of batch. processing as well, where they're offline and doing their processing. So it's not always easy to measure that SLI because they're not really part of the request path anymore. So things we want to care about when it's batch. Did you actually finish the batch? And did you finish it in the time that you gave yourself to finish the batch? That's a great way to measure your SLIs. Were you doing it off recent data? And do you have a threshold to measure that? It's especially important off cached systems where you need to check your cache hits, right? And finally, of course, there's latency in all of this. Sometimes data processing is part of the request path, and you need to make sure you plug in latency in that and you measure that latency for those kinds of requests. So if you've got some kind of like ML process, or maybe it's get recommendations for a customer, that's a little bit of data processing. These are the kinds of things you should be thinking of when you're building the SLI or the measurement for your SLO. Boop. And finally, we talk about storage, because really, data isn't persistent. Is it even real? There should be only one thing you care about: storage. Did you actually write it properly? Is it good? Did you get an error on right? Durability is what you care about when you're doing storage. This is probably the hardest kind of SLI to write, because you may need to check durability with a secondary check. And that's the key here. You'll do one thing that actually writes the data, and then you're going to have a thing to test that data. You should be building your SLIs off the thing that tests the data, not the things that write the data. That's probably part of your request response anyways. So that's more of a latency check. But when you're checking to see, did you actually persist the data in the right way we wanted to? Did you get the right bytes or number of bytes written, those kinds of things? So it's your durability tester, your thing that checks the storage itself. You're going to build your SLIs against that to ensure that you've written that data and it can be reread again later on in life. Certainly, if that's failing and it's failing at a high rate, you have an issue and you want to get that fixed. I will also come out and say your storage SLIs should be of the highest 9s because of things like this. Durability and ensuring that the data is correct does matter to people. Meanwhile, your request response SLIs could be far fewer 9s because of that's where a lot of the traffic and the volume already exist. And while we're talking about SLIs and what do they look like? Boop. How do you get there, right? How do we define the success? How do we understand what is happiness? Okay, I'm going to take the request response kind of use case here, and we're going to talk about that one a little bit more and drill into it a lot more to really get at that. So I'm not going to tell you how to get the number yet. We're going to get to that one in a little bit. Let's talk about breaking it down into how you define a success and where you find it. So a good way to think about it is a percentage of all your requests on a specific user path, right? Profile user, API scores, whatever it is, excluding everything except for the ones that matter, or they must return a proper HTTP status code, excluding maybe status codes that are clearly outside of your control, like a 429. If they're banging away and you're having to rate limit them, you probably don't want to count that in the SLI. It probably doesn't make sense. It's really them that are just DDoSing you or whatever it could be, right? There's a few other status codes that probably matter for you here as well that you may want to double check on, like the teapot one, for example. But make sure that you're looking at status codes properly. And you ideally want to measure these as close to the user as possible. Load balancer, or perhaps the very front door of your API service itself. And that's where we want to kind of define the SLI itself. And what does that SLI definition look like? Ooh. This is kind of the premise of every single SLI formula in Honeycomb. The very first line you see, if, should I measure this? What is success? And you maybe look at this, that's an if statement. It feels a little weird, right? Like, where's the third argument, right? Because all you're doing is you're checking if I should measure it, and then you're saying success, but success is my true. Let me explain how this works a little bit more, okay? And the second line really helps you understand that. Do you qualify to be measured? If true, evaluate that qualification. So if you are a root span, if not exist, trace that parent ID, meaning I'm a root span, then duration, what is success is less than 3,000 milliseconds or 3 seconds. The next line, the third line, also kind of goes on the same way. If the name of the route that we're hitting is endpoint v1, status code less than 300. I will say, however, and though we don't have an example of it right here, I highly encourage you to combine the less than duration 3000 and less than HTTP status code 300 into a single thing. So you put the and keyword there and wrap those two up in and. That way there, you're checking for both latency and error status codes within that same SLI. Quite frankly, if you're slow, the user is not happy. If you return an error, the user is not happy. They're both the same thing. Don't count them separately, because then you're trying to set targets separately. It's a one single request. Measure yourself like that. I still haven't told you how to find your numbers. We're going to get there, I promise. First, I want to talk about iterating these things. Boop. So you need to start with your most critical service flows first. User journeys. Think about these ones. Which user journeys really matter to you? The more critical this thing is, the more nines you're going to apply to it. And I don't mean just straight nines. This could be 295, right? 395, or sometimes it's just 98% even, 95%. If that's what matters to you, you could do those as well. But when you do these and you develop them, always be thinking to yourself, what defines happiness? What would really make a happy customer? People say, oh, wow, Pierre, we really struggle with that. Until you start with your product manager, person who created and defined what this thing is going to do and thought about it, probably has some kind of inkling of what it is. Maybe it's even buried in some weird Google Doc or Quip Doc somewhere. More importantly, you're going to iterate on this thing. Your first definition will not be perfect. If it is perfect, you are a unicorn. You're probably not a unicorn. It won't be perfect. It's okay. If you go into defining these things with the idea of, I'm trying to take a stab at it and I'm going to iterate on this thing for the first little bit until we nail it and we get it just right. Okay. And one thing I want to do is be careful with your thresholds. Do not set your thresholds as such that your SLI in normal operations runs at 90%. That's not real. Okay. If all you're doing is burning 10% of your errors under normal operation, I think your threshold isn't hard enough. I don't think you're measuring yourself to a high enough standard. And you should really be thinking about a higher standard to measure yourself against. Likewise, if you build your SLO and you're down to 10% or negative on your error budget, now you've got a problem. And maybe you set your threshold too high on your initial stab. Or maybe legitimately you got a problem in your system, you got to go fix it. I don't know. But you want to kind of find a balance. SLOs in the 30 to 70% range, if that's where they stay normally, is probably healthy. Now, I know you're probably thinking to yourself, Pierre, you just told me it's okay for me to have errors. Yeah, let's all take a good deep breath right now and admit this to ourselves right now. All applications are always broken in some way or form a little tiny bit. SLOs are here to help you understand when they are too broken. So admit to yourself it's always a little bit broken, and we're going to accept that. There's always going to be some weird network glitch somewhere. There's always going to be somebody hitting a request in the middle of a deployment where the request gets misrouted, right? And we're deploying a new node or new pod. So let's just admit to ourselves, there will be some errors all the time. And we're building SLOs to alert us when there are too many errors. And let's talk about what those burn rates look like. Oop.
I have a question before we boot.
Oh, yes, Jenny, please.
Is there anyone on the call that's actually used Honeycomb SLOs and would love to hear a story of a time where you had to like iterate on your SLO? Nobody.
Okay.
Okay.
Maybe people just need to get started with them.
Okay.
So let's talk a little bit about burn rates.
So before we move on,
yeah.
it looks like Ankit does have a question in the chat.
No. How does sampling affect SLI SLO? Oh, yes. In Honeycomb, when you sample data, and your sampling rates can be dynamic between event, from one event to another, you attach a sample rate to those events when they sent in. All queries, including SLO queries, take your sample rate into consideration and add it as part of what you see. So if you have a failure on something that was heavily sampled, it'll skew your SLO higher than if it was not heavily sampled because of the sample rate change. So we do this for all queries in Honeycomb. It's actually one of the benefits of why sampling is okay in Honeycomb, because we don't skew your counts away from what is statistically accurate. Okay, let's talk about burn alerts and burn rates. So first off, burn alerts go off. They happen. They always happen all the time. I'm trying to show some things here is we resolved this incident. So the blue line was happy, it's fine. It did not trigger a pager duty, but it did trigger perhaps a JIRA or a Slack alert. So it notified us about it. But we still had plenty of time, perhaps days here. When I say plenty of time, I mean more than 24 hours before we had to be alerted about it. So that red line would have took 24 plus hours to get there. So therefore, this did not alert everybody. This is what we call a slow burn. And it's kind of what we wanted to showcase here, right? Is that the line looks steep, but it was taking time over time. It depends on how big this SLO was done on. I believe this is a 30-day chart. So you're actually looking at about a day and a half there for that line to go down. So it would have took several more days for it to fall all the way down. So a fast burn is you're going to consume weeks worth of budget in hours. That's a fast burn. We want to alert you. A slow burn is you're going to take a long time to consume that, but you will eventually consume them all. You're going to take many days to consume your week's worth of budget. And that's where we want to make sure we separate the two and we understand when to alert you from one versus the other. Boop. So a fast one is probably an incident. You're probably going to put this in pager duty. You're probably going to wake somebody up and say, please fix this now. A slow burn, probably more like tech debt. It could be an incident, but it could also be classified as something perhaps you just need to fix it. And we've seen slow burns. Perhaps you look at it and say, I've got a 30-day SLO, and I'm going to burn through that SLO in 7 days. That's a slow burn because you're giving yourself 28 or 30 days. You're going to do it in 7. But you've given yourself 3 or 4 days to actually fix it. And you could prioritize your engineering development without making it an incident. And these are some of the really great powers of understanding SLOs and why they matter to you, is understanding where to put your engineering priorities. You don't want to always be fighting fires. And if you treated every single thing as a fast burn, you'd always be fighting fires. That's all you do. We have a few more things to talk about SLOs, but in the sake of time, I'm going to pause here because we do shift gears, getting a little bit nerdier. I'm going to open it up for questions if you have any more questions remaining. And Jenny, you could probably boop like 6 or 7 more times to get to the question slide. This is a build. And I think that's the last one. Awesome. So with that, I know we had the one question about sampling. Any other questions about SLOs? Are y'all going to run off and start building them right away?
Excuse me, I have one question regarding
Sure.
SLO. So in the dashboard, there is something called, let me just double check. The historical SLO compliance.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean in more details?
Historical SLO compliance is effectively if I took your SLI column and I did an average of it, where 1 is success and 0 is failure. And if you do an average on that, that's what that chart would look like. Okay. So what is it trying to tell you? If you could, if you have a target that should be represented on that chart as a yellow line. If you're always above that yellow line, even if you're burning away, you will always be fine for your overall. It's not a slow burn. It's just a little bit of a burn. Your users are still happy. But if your compliance is going below that yellow line, maybe it's dipping below and come back up, dipping below, come back up, dipping below, come back up, I would be concerned that you perhaps have a slow burn happening and you want to address it with technical debt.
I see.
If you have a fast burn, it doesn't matter. The error budget will trigger it for you, and your compliance chart will be negative for that time period as well. But you could have your compliance chart dip below without having a fast burn, and those are more what we call a slow burn. So it helps you understand those. Is what it does. But if you want to understand what it is in detail, it's if I took your SLI, 1 represented success, 0 represented failure, and I just did an average on that value.
I see. Cool. Appreciate it.
So if there are no more questions, let's get back to that t-shirt thing. Bethany, can you drop the link to the QR code for people who may not have a phone in their hands? Oh, she did drop the link to the QR code. I'm just behind myself. 2 messages ago, there's a link in chat. Please click that or scan that little QR code with your phone. Fill out the survey, get yourself an eye test and prod shirt. You all want an eye test and prod shirt. I know you do. We see them around quite a bit now. But that's the way you get one. You have to have this filled out by tomorrow at noon Pacific time. So you got a little more than 24 hours to get that done. And we really appreciate your feedback on this event. Was it useful? Was it crappy? Did we waste your hour? If we did, let us know. Because we really want to build these webinars for you. And if we're not doing a good thing, we want to know about it so we can do better things.
And if you have, questions later on, feel free to hit us up in Pollinators and Slack. I'm Jenny Honeycomb, Pierre Honeycomb, Brian Honeycomb. It's very easy to find us, and we're here to help you guys. But thank you so much for coming and coming to our first best practices session. Yay! Okay, well, I think we can wrap. So thanks again, everyone. And thank you for being Honeycomb users. We really, really appreciate that. And happy, keep calm and query on.
Yeah.